Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
There are stories buried in the sands of time, long ignored, dismissed, or deliberately hidden. Stories of a people whose identity has been rewritten, whose legacy has been scattered across continents, and whose bloodline may flow through rivers of forgotten heritage. In the age of digital revival, where ancient scrolls meet satellite evidence, a single question stirs louder than ever. Were the original Hebrews black? Ethiopia, long-standing as a cradle of ancient spirituality and a living museum of Judeo-Christian continuity, may hold the answer. Through the dust-covered manuscripts of Aksum and the chants of monastic orders who memorize scripture older than most empires, we find a window into a past deliberately obscured. And within this window, Ethiopia doesn't just suggest, they declare, yes, the original Hebrews were black. And they have the receipts. To understand this story, one must begin not in modern Israel or Europe, but in the highlands of East Africa, where the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church preserves one of the oldest versions of the Bible on earth, written in Guizi, an extinct Semitic language once spoken by kings, prophets, and scribes. The Ethiopian Bible includes books excluded from most Western canons, such as 1 Enoch, Jubilees, and the Book of the Covenant, all containing references to a sacred lineage stretching back to antiquity. Unlike the Eurocentric reinterpretations that emerged during colonialism and slavery, the Ethiopian tradition has preserved an image of the biblical world where black identity is not incidental but central. The Kebra Nagast, translated as the glory of the kings, stands the heart of Ethiopia's historical claim to the Hebrew legacy. This ancient text, compiled in the 14th century but based on oral and written traditions far older, recounts the story of how the Queen of Sheba, referred to as Makeda in Ethiopian tradition, traveled to Jerusalem to meet King Solomon. Their union, it says, produced a son, Menelik. This prince would later return to Ethiopia with the Ark of the Covenant, establishing the Solomonic dynasty that ruled Ethiopia for centuries. While Western scholars often dismiss the Kebra Nagast as myth, archaeological and genetic studies increasingly show Semitic cultural transmission and bloodlines stretching from ancient Israel to the Horn of Africa, suggesting there may be more truth than fiction in Ethiopia's royal chronicles. Crucially, Ethiopians never viewed themselves as separate from the biblical narrative. They saw themselves as living within it. For them, Moses, Aaron, and the prophets were not foreign whitewashed figures, but part of a shared ancestry rooted in Africa. The presence of Falasha Jews, now known as Beta Israel, further underscores this continuity. Practicing a pre-Talmudic form of Judaism, the Beta Israel community in Ethiopia maintained Hebrew customs, dietary laws, and scriptural traditions for over 2,000 years, isolated from Europe and untouched by Rabbinic Judaism. Their existence baffled many European scholars who, operating from racialized assumptions, could not conceive that black Africans could be the descendants of the original Israelites. But DNA studies in the 20th and 21st centuries showed links between the Beta Israel and Middle Eastern populations, especially among the Kohanim, priestly caste line, adding yet another layer of credibility to their ancient claim. The biblical descriptions themselves challenge modern Western portrayals. The Song of Solomon opens with the words, "I am black and beautiful, O daughters of Jerusalem." Moses' wife Zipporah was a Cushite, meaning from the land south of Egypt, which today is Sudan and Ethiopia. In Numbers 12, when Miriam and Aaron challenge Moses' authority because of his Ethiopian wife, God responds by afflicting Miriam with leprosy, a direct rebuke that appears to defend the Ethiopian connection. In Jeremiah 13 verse 23, the prophet rhetorically asks, "Can the Ethiopian change his skin?" implying a recognition of the dark skin tone of Africans as a natural and integral part of God's creation, not something to be erased or despised. And in Acts 8, the Apostle Philip baptizes an Ethiopian eunuch, a high-ranking official of the Candace, Queen of Ethiopia. This moment is not just symbolic, it marks the spread of early Christianity directly into Africa, not through colonization, but through dignified royal diplomacy. In iconography, too, Ethiopia offers what the Western world systematically erased. Before the Middle Ages, many depictions of Jesus, Mary, and the saints in Ethiopian manuscripts show them with tightly curled hair, dark brown skin, and African features. The Kebra Gospels, two illuminated manuscripts dated between the 5th and 7th centuries AD, contain some of the earliest Christian artwork still preserved in the world. And in them, Jesus does not look European. He looks like the very people of Ethiopia, who preserve his teachings through bloodshed, famine, and centuries of isolation. When European colonizers brought their pale depictions of a blue-eyed Christ, they were not offering salvation, they were offering substitution. Language itself holds the memory of shared origin. Guizi, the liturgical language of Ethiopia, shares roots with ancient Hebrew and Aramaic. The similarities in grammar, alphabet, and structure are not coincidental. They point to a shared Semitic heritage. Terms like El, Elohim, Yahweh, and Sabbath are preserved in both Ethiopian liturgy and ancient Hebrew texts. Furthermore, the name Ethiopia, from the Greek Ethiops, meaning burnt face, appears in the Bible multiple times. Psalm 68 verse 31 declares, "Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God," not as a footnote, but as prophecy. The presence of Ethiopia in biblical prophecy is undeniable, and the reverence for her role has been etched into African Christian identity for millennia. It is important to realize that the whitewashing of Hebrew identity did not begin with innocent theological reflection. It was a strategic project. From the time of the transatlantic slave trade to the Jim Crow era, the identity of the ancient Israelites was reimagined to reflect European aesthetics. This helped to justify both slavery and colonialism. After all, if the Israelites were imagined as white and Africans as cursed descendants of Ham, then racial hierarchies could be framed as divinely ordained. Ethiopia, however, remained a stubborn contradiction to this mythology. It was never colonized except for a brief Italian occupation, and it maintained its own ancient biblical tradition outside of Western theological control. The Ethiopian claim to Hebrew heritage was a direct challenge to imperial theology, and for that reason, it was suppressed, mocked, and ignored. But in recent decades, African American communities, the Rastafari movement, and Hebrew Israelite groups have begun to reconnect with this heritage. Figures such as Marcus Garvey, Haile Selassie, and Dr. Yosef Benjo-Cannon all pointed to Ethiopia as a spiritual homeland. These thinkers, though controversial in some circles, were not merely constructing myth, they were reclaiming stolen history. The journey back to Ethiopia is not about nationalism, but restoration. It's about piecing together a shattered identity and recognizing that the descendants of the Hebrews may have walked across the Red Sea with melanin in their skin and Africa in their bones. The weight of history is not only in words, but in the silence that surrounds them. For centuries, the idea of black Hebrews was considered fringe, heretical, or delusional. But today, as more voices rise from Ethiopia's mountains and diaspora communities remember the ancient names, the question becomes harder to dismiss. Were the original Hebrews black? Ethiopia has kept the scrolls, sung the Psalms, honored the Sabbath, and preserved the prophecy. Whether in the mountains of Lalibela or the deserts of Gondar, they have never stopped believing. And if belief is the soul of history, then Ethiopia's testimony is more than enough.